All right, I'm Susan Page, and I'm here with Nancy Hollander, and we are doing an oral history today, and today is November 13th, 2018. And thank you, Nancy, for agreeing to do this.
You're welcome.
And I think we're just going to kind of start at the beginning and work our way through. So is there anything about your childhood, early adolescence? Where are you from? Start where you'd like to.
Well, let me see where, I don't even know where to start. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. Parents who were New Yorkers, and we ended up in Texas, which is a very long story, but that's where I grew up. Then I went to college in the University of Michigan. I was a pre-med student, chemistry major. There was a war on that some people have forgotten now, Vietnam. And I didn't have time for all those science courses. And at the same time, to go marching against the war and doing civil rights. I got arrested probably the first week I was there in a case involving fair housing. And that's how I started my college career. I very quickly stopped being a chemistry major and sat down and looked to see what could I major in that had the least number of required courses and the most number of electives so I could do whatever I wanted. And that was sociology with a minor in psychology, and so that's what I did.
All right. All right. And so now, so was there, it doesn't sound like there was much that happened before you got to college that sort of bent you towards the law.
Well, I didn't know it was bending me towards the law. I didn't really fit in Texas. I was 10 years old when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. We had a debate in my school, and I was the only one on the side of Brown versus the Board of Education. The teacher called my mother and said that she was worried that I was so outspoken that other children wouldn't like me. And my mother said, well, I'll talk to her, and didn't. When I was in the 6th grade, my mother was she was a pacifist, but a very big businesswoman in Texas, and a very strong woman, and I think had a huge impact on me. When I was in the 6th grade, she gave me a copy of Ibsen's A Doll's House to read and said, this will make you a feminist. I took it to school, and the teacher again complained and said I wasn't old enough to be reading this book. And I brought it home, and my mother said, well, don't worry, just read it at home. So you could say that's what
started you going in the right direction.
Right.
All right. And so you did get your degree then at the University of Michigan in sociology, minor in psychology?
I did.
What year did you graduate from college?
I graduated from college in 1965, I believe.
All right.
And I went to Chicago. I got married. I went to Chicago. We worked in an organization called JOIN, Jobs or Income Now. This was an SDS project. SDS was Students for a Democratic Society, something that very few people remember. But we were working in this community. I learned how to become a photographer in the basement of Jesse Jackson's church. I learned how to develop film. I sent someone out who was traveling to buy me as much Nikon as he could get for $200, which turned out to be a really nice Nikon F, and I became a photographer. And we wrote a book called Uptown, which was published by Harper and Row in 1969, ultimately. I did that. I then moved to Cincinnati, organized there, moved back to Chicago, worked in a camera store, did a lot of things, ended up in New Mexico with a 2-year-old child. My parents had since moved here. I met a man named Paul Phillips, who at that time was the chairman of the board of the New Mexico Civil Liberties Union. He was a friend of my parents. I met him at a dinner party. He said, we're looking for someone to be our first full-time executive director, and I said, that would be me. 9 people applied for that job. We were all interviewed together. It was a horrible interview. Bill Dixon was one of the people who interviewed me, Judge Allen, various people who I came to know later in the law field. And I got the job, and I worked for the ACLU until I went to law school.
Let me just flesh that out. That's Judge Frank Allen, right?
Yes.
Who was one of the, I believe was a freedom rider, is what I understand.
Really? It's
Yeah.
very likely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I used to practice in front of him quite a
And
bit.
Bill Dixon, who was a well-known lawyer in New Mexico. Paul Phillips was a well-known lawyer in New Mexico. And they were on the group who interviewed me for that job. And through that job, I got to know the entire legal community, all the judges. Charlie Daniels was my legal director. I had, toward the end of that period, I worked out of my home and then finally got an office downtown with a secretary.
Now, you said you went here, went there, and ended up in New Mexico, and that's always the question I ask people when I'm just casually talking to people in the back of the courtroom waiting for my case to get called. So can you describe how you ended up in New Mexico, of all places?
Well, my parents had moved to New Mexico and had retired here from Texas. So they were here. I was married to a man who had an alcohol problem of rather major proportions, and I had to leave in the middle of the night with my child, basically. That saga continued on and off for a while, but that's how I ended up in New Mexico. I went to the only place I could go.
And be safe.
And be safe, which, because I had no money. I had $35, which was the rent money. I used it to take a taxi to St. Louis. My father had bought a plane ticket for me. At that time, you could buy a plane ticket in Albuquerque and pick it up in St. Louis. I don't think you can do that anymore, but that's what I did, and my son and I arrived here. That's how I got to New Mexico.
All right. So that was in Albuquerque. You came
Right.
to Albuquerque. All right. So I'm gathering that at the end of this, you knew all the legal community. When in there did you decide, maybe I'll go to law school?
Well, going to law school never entered my mind. I thought about, at that point, I was working for the ACLU. I needed more. I was either going to go to a bigger city and work for a bigger ACLU group or do something else. I thought about going, I think I applied to Planned Parenthood, and then I thought about going back to medical school, which is where I had always planned to go. But at this point, I had a 6-year-old child, 5 or 6-year-old child, maybe 5. I was almost 30 years old. I was a woman. It was very hard to go to medical school as someone at that age, at that time, and as a woman. And I hadn't taken all the courses. I had taken biology, comparative anatomy, chemistry. I had not taken organic chemistry. I figured I would need a year
Just to get the prerequisites.
to get the prerequisites. This is a very strange story, but I went to a Hanukkah party at Paul Phillips' house, where everyone was, ACLU people, Bill Dixon, Charlie Driscoll, people who people now don't remember. And Bill Dixon was married to a woman named Karen, who was a poet, and she said, "I want to read your poem." And I said, okay. And here we are at this party. We had probably consumed alcohol and who knows what other substances. And I went in the bathroom with her saying, I don't really believe any of this stuff, Karen, but it looks like fun, right? So she's looking at my hand and she says, oh, there's your lifeline. And that means medicine is in your future. And I said, I remember this very well. I said, medicine's in everyone's future. You go to doctors, you get sick. We all have medicine in our future. She said, no, I mean becoming a doctor. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. How could you know this, that I've been thinking of this? And we stopped, and she said, palmistry is not what's in your future, it's what you think is in your future. And I said, how did you know? I haven't talked to anyone about this. She said, well, you know, I'm an intuitive person, and that's why I'm good at this. Well, none of that makes any sense to me, but I went out and I discussed it. I went out and I said, the strangest thing just happened. And the next day, I remember talking to Charlie Driscoll about it. The next day, my son and I went to visit a friend. He had a little, like what they call now a play date. We didn't have that word, hadn't existed yet, but he went to play with his little friend Joaquin, and I was sitting with Joaquin's mother, Pilar, having coffee. And I told her about this, and she said, well, you know what that means? I said, what? She said, it means you should go to law school. That's the medicine that you do. I said, oh, had never thought of that. So the next day I go into my secretary and I said, tell her what happened. And I said, would you call the law school? Her name was Margaret Ward. Would you call the law school? And she calls and she said, today's the last day to apply. So we run over there, get the forms, apply, take the LSAT, and apply to law school and go to law school. And I never applied to any other law school because I didn't have any money to go anywhere. And I went to law school. Charlie Driscoll, I remember, watched my son and my dog when I took the LSAT. Various people wrote letters for me who I knew. Ann Bingaman wrote a letter for me, who's Bingaman's wife. Ann Bingaman was a professor. Charlie Driscoll wrote a letter. Charlie's letter was, Dear Dean, I think it was Dean Hart, Dear Dean, whoever it was, Nancy will make a great lawyer. Sincerely, Charlie Driscoll, knowing nothing more than that we had been hanging out together at the ACLU. And I went to law school. There you have it.
All right.
Strange story.
Well, it is, but it's a good story, so why not? So, was there, what had any particular impact on you in law school? I'll ask you the easier question first. How many women were in your class as a proportion?
My class was the first one with half women. So we were 100 students, 50, I think 100 students, 50 were women. And we were the first class with that many women. They had converted one of the men's bathrooms into a women's bathroom by that time, because originally there weren't any, or maybe there was one. And then they converted one upstairs. And I went to law school. I was never interested in anything except being a criminal defense lawyer. Well, that was, you know, that was my history from Chicago. I had worked with defendants and would-be defendants in the streets of Chicago. That's how I met my son's father, the one I left, and who ultimately came to New Mexico with me, or after me. But I'd been working with the ACLU. I'd been working, that's just all I was interested in. I wasn't interested in anything else.
All right, so you weren't interested in pursuing civil rights on the civil side as a profession?
No, I really wasn't, although I have done some major civil rights cases. I don't know that I really knew about them then. What I knew was criminal defense. I knew I wasn't interested in anything else.
All right. And was there any particular courses or anything you took during law school that were particularly helpful, or even the opposite, where you found out when you got out that whoever was teaching this had obviously not been in the trenches?
Well, I took courses from Charlie Daniels. Those were important. I worked for Leo Romero. I got a job working for Leo Romero, was teaching criminal law my first semester, which was great because it meant I got to sit in the teacher's lounge and work. And then I met Ruth Kovnat and decided that I would take whatever she taught. And that's my advice to law students now. which is it doesn't matter what course you take, find a professor you can relate to and take everything they teach. And I took environmental law, which I really didn't have any interest in, but I took it because she taught it. I took everything that Desi taught.
Desi, that's what's his whole name? I
Robert
can't remember. Robert
Desiderio.
Desiderio, okay.
I took everything Desi taught because I could learn from him. I was told to take every course you need for the bar, so I did that.
So you even took things like UCC,
Oh, yeah.
Uniform Commercial Code.
I
which I
did.
can never even remember what that stands
It's
for.
for,
That's how
yeah.
little I dealt with that, yeah.
I took the UCC course from Fred Hart, and it was a good course. He was another one I could learn from, but I took everything. There's some courses I can't remember. I took corporations, and I asked Ted Parnell recently, I said, did I take that from you? He said, I don't know, I can't remember. And I said, well, I can't remember either, Ted. I know I took it from somebody.
But it didn't come up in your life too much after
No,
that.
it didn't.
Yeah. Now, did you do any particular activities besides classes while you were in law school? You were working, it sounds like.
Well,
That's an activity.
I worked in the summers. My parents then moved to Costa Rica, and my son spent his summers with them in Costa Rica. And I worked. I didn't do, and I did law review. I didn't do moot court because I had a child. I mean, I couldn't do anything that required me to do more than go to law school during the semesters. The program then it was an interesting program, and I took it in the summer, and it was a clinic. It was called Centro Legal. We had an office down here on 4th Street. We handled, the law school students handled all the misdemeanors for Bernalillo County. And I took that course in the summer because I needed to take it when I didn't have my son with me, so I had time. And there was a woman, I don't remember, her first name was Alice. She'd not even been to law school, but her job was to go to the arraignments and meet everyone. And then the law students would come, and I learned just enough Spanish at the time to say, "Momento, señor, otro abogado viene que habla español." You know, someone, just wait a minute, someone's coming who really speaks Spanish. Or, "De dónde, where are you from? Tiene la mica, do you have a green card?" So I could do the very first things. And then I tried cases. I tried jury trials, I tried DWI cases, I tried an assault. I represented a prostitute who was charged with prostitution. So by the time I finished that summer, I had tried 2 or 3 jury trials. I had done motions to suppress in front of, was his name O'Toole? Was a judge, and he suppressed a knife, I remember that. And I'd done a lot by the time I got out of law school. It was a great course.
And that was before Metro Court, I'm guessing?
Yes,
so
there was no
municipal
Metro Court.
Or was it magistrate?
It was magistrate court, and but we did all the misdemeanors.
Right, right. And you mentioned Charlie Daniels earlier, and I just want to clarify for whoever's listening to this later, he's on the Supreme Court now.
Right, he's a justice on the Supreme Court. He was my legal director. He was, of course, a mentor. I took everything. He took criminal procedure from him. I don't know if I took anything else. There was an evidence trial practice program at the law school then. It's very different than the one that ultimately Leo did and that Barbara Bergman did, Leo Romero and Barbara Bergman. This one, Paul Bardicke was my person, and he was an adjunct, and at that time you had the same adjunct all the way through. Now they don't do it that way, and there are lots of adjuncts. But Paul Bardicke was my adjunct, so I learned evidence trial practice from Leo Romero and Paul Bardicke.
All right, and Paul Bardicke, you then went on to be Attorney General.
That's right.
All right. So you worked before law school, and we kind of talked about that a little bit. So you foresaw while you were in school that you were going to be a criminal defense lawyer. So where did you begin doing that once you got out of school?
Well, I was sworn in on October 10th.
So you passed the bar exam on your first try?
Yes, and then I was, yes, I passed the bar on my first try. I was sworn in on October 10th, 1978, 40 years ago. And I started the public defender, I think on October 11th or 12th, literally immediately thereafter. Our swearing in was interesting because we were protesting something. I think it was the bar not being fair to minorities. And so they were worried about what we were going to do, so they split us up, and we got sworn in very small groups at the Supreme Court in Santa Fe, but it was only a group. So I got sworn in on the 10th, and then a bunch of my friends got sworn in on the 11th, and I went back and moved their admission. And it was so much fun to get to go to the Supreme Court and to say, my very first motion as a lawyer is to move the admission of my friends.
That is kind of cool.
It was cool. Yeah. Paul Phillips moved my admission, and that was very cool. And he and his wife Casey both have passed now, but they then took me to lunch, and it was a big event.
Yeah.
And then I started the public defender, and 2 days later, I started I had a felony. Public defender only handled felonies at that time because the law school was still doing the misdemeanors. And I was there for 14 months. I tried 22 felony cases, everything you can imagine. The prosecutor, the DA at the time, had a no plea policy.
And who was that? Is that Ira Robinson?
Yes, it was.
So.
Yes, it was Ira, and that didn't last too long because it's impossible.
Yeah.
But it lasted for a couple years, and so you could either plead to the indictment, or you could try the case. And there was one lawyer who had kind of a bad reputation because, and I don't even remember her name, because she pled too many. But the rest of us just tried everything. We just tried everything. And it was, for me, and probably not such a great experience for my clients because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but it was a great experience for me because I got to know all the judges, all the prosecutors, many of whom I know to this day. Some of whom are still around. Jim Tierney's still around. Larry Gomez, up until recently, was still around. And those are people who started right about when I did on the other side.
Yeah, there's something about that sort of cohort you go along with, and it kind of stays with you for a long time. Now, you say you did every kind of felony. Can you give us kind of a from this to that kind of thing? I don't mean just exactly charges, but...
Well, I did, my first case was an arson case, a guy who blew up his wife's car. And then I had some murder cases. There weren't so many child abuse cases then, so I don't remember having any then. Murder, I had a couple fraud cases, and then I started doing drug cases. And I became the drug case person. I did Mark Chenard's case. Mark just died. I just saw his obituary. Mark Chenard was my client, and that became a famous case. There's a Chenard rule about lost evidence as a result of that case.
And who was Mark Chenard before he did this? Wasn't he a lawyer?
No, he became a lawyer later.
Oh, okay.
He was a EMT, got into some trouble with some cocaine. It became a famous case in New Mexico. The cocaine disappeared from the evidence room while he was disappeared. He came back, and we tried the case on the theory that it was pharmaceutical cocaine, which was not illegal at the time. It is illegal now, but I learned the whole course of organic chemistry in the course of that case, and hired a chemist named Ben Shapiro. It was a huge case. Sasha Sema was on this one side of it. Jimmy Blackmer was on it. And ultimately, we won for a while. We lost. We ultimately lost. But at that time, you could come back and have a resentencing. I don't think you can do that now. Have a resentencing at the end. And Mark had I'd managed to keep him out of jail the whole time. He had cleaned up his act, got a degree, and Jimmy Blackmer came and wanted to agree with me that he should get probation. We were in front of Frank Allen, Judge
Blackmer
Allen.
was the prosecutor at the time.
And Jimmy Blackmer was the prosecutor, right. And he got probation and went on to go to law school.
All right. So that's basically talking about the public defender, which was about 14 months, so 22 trials in 14 months.
Yes, it got us to the end of 1979, and I was trying so many cases, I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it, one after another. And I went to see Charlie Daniels, and I said, Charlie, I've had a case that starts on Monday, ends on Friday, 3 times in a row. I've got to have a week off for my sake and my client's sake and my son's sake.
And what was his position then?
He was a lawyer here.
Oh, okay.
Friedman. It was Friedman, Boyd, and Daniels, this law firm, the 3 of them. And David Friedman, John Boyd, and Charlie Daniels. And they had a little office over on Roma, the Roundhouse. And I said, Charlie, I don't know what to do. And he said, here's what you do. He said, if a judge calls you up on Monday, you go before him and you say, with all due respect for the court, he said, that's how you start when you're not going to be respectful. And you say, I can't do it, and then if he locks you up, call me and I'll get you out of jail. And fortunately, I didn't get a case, but nothing came up for that Monday. On Wednesday of that week, which was in November of 1979, I was in the office having lunch. We all ate lunch together. And I got a call from Charlie, and he said, can you come over and talk to us? And he said, I'm afraid you're going to go somewhere else. If because we had always talked about I was going to work for them, but they didn't have any money to hire me, they didn't have any place for me, and he had said, go do something else for a while.
Sure.
And I said, I can't keep this up. I can't take my son to the dentist. I mean, I just cannot keep this up. And he talked the other 2 into hiring me. And January 1st, 1980, I started. I shared an office with Lee Pfeiffer, who was then there. I mean, we literally shared an office. My desk was John Boyd's dining room table that they moved in for me. And I started in this law firm, and I've been here ever since.
All right, and I think I said at the beginning, this is 2018, so it's a long time to be in the same place.
Right. And David Friedman's still here, and John Boyd's still here, and Charlie was here until he became a justice.
That's right, because he wasn't one of those people who worked his way up as judge.
No.
He just went straight to the Supremes, so. All right. So I think you've already mentioned that he was an influential person in your career. Is there anybody else you'd want to mention as an influential person in over the course of the rest of your career? Or any people? I don't want to limit it to one.
Charlie Driscoll was a big influence. Charlie was a rather crazy lawyer here. That's putting it mildly for those who remember him. And he ultimately became a priest, but he was a big influence on me and a big, very supportive mentor. And I think the 2 of them together were the real mentors I had in the law.
Right. And then how did your career evolve once you started at Friedman, Boyd, and Daniels? Where you started at the dining room table in a small office with somebody else, and where did it go from there?
Well, and Charlie walked in a couple days later and handed me a case, said, I'm going out of town. Try this case, make sure you win it. Well, thanks, Charlie.
No pressure.
No pressure. And I did win, fortunately. It was a jury trial. It was a burglary, an auto burglary or something. He came back and said, did you win it? And I said, yes. He said, good, and walked out. Typical Charlie.
Yeah.
And then started doing lots of drug cases. Then I started doing lots of child abuse cases. I started teaching. I taught a trial practice course at the law school, and I became active in the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, put together training programs for them, headed the amicus committee, got to know a lot of lawyers, became the first woman president of NACDL in 1992. And right around that time, I was doing a lot of teaching, and someone asked me if I wanted to teach in Russia, and I said yes. And so I taught a training program for Russian criminal defense lawyers, went to Russia 5 or 6 times.
Was that all in Moscow or different places?
In Moscow and St. Petersburg. We did it in both places. And then Ted Parnell, who had been a dean at this law school, was working in Vietnam and asked me if I wanted to come and do some work there for the UN, and I said yes. And back in 1965, I had gone to Indonesia and met with Vietnamese women, and then come back and spoken against the war. These were Vietnamese women on the other side of the U.S., North Vietnam, V's, and the National Liberation Front women. And when I went back to Vietnam with Ted in 1998, I actually met one again, Madam Bin, who by then was vice president, and just to go to the immediate time, I saved all my stuff from 1965, and just this summer gave it to a woman who took it to Hanoi, and it's going to be the Nancy Hollander Archives at the Women's Museum, and it includes my notes from that meeting and pamphlets and letters and scarves, all kinds of things that I've been trying to get back to Hanoi all this time. So I'm going to Hanoi in February. There's still 2 Vietnamese women and me were the only ones still alive from that trip.
And if I remember, February is New Year's in...
Right, I'm going right after Tet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was a little younger than you, but I do remember the Tet Offensive, so.
Right.
All right. So now I think that's covered a couple of the things I have on my list here of significant contributions and associations you're proud of, because that's a lot to be proud of. Did you ever think of becoming a judge?
No, I never thought of becoming a judge. I don't think I've lived my life to do that. There are a lot of questions I wouldn't want to have asked. And I think it would just be really boring, really, really boring to be a judge. I would get frustrated by bad lawyering. I'd have to pay attention so much. And I'm not good at it. I mean, I don't learn by listening that well. That's not how I learn. And I think my mind would wander and then I would miss something. I just don't think I would be good at it, and I have no interest in it.
I just could almost write that down and sign my name to that, so that I think is a pledge we should all make.
Yeah.
Now, just ask this because that comes up with a lot of people in the criminal world. Did you think about switching sides and becoming a prosecutor or going to the federal side of things?
No to all of that. I've certainly done federal work, but I've never prosecuted. I would never prosecute. It would never even occur to me that I would prosecute. As I say to people now, I've been fighting the government all my life, and now I get paid for it. And I would not, I don't believe that most people should be in jail. I don't think we should put people in little cages. I think we're better than that. We're a country. When I give lectures now, and I now lecture, and I still teach. I teach all around the world. I was just teaching Swedish lawyers last week. And I give talks because I represent people in Guantanamo and at the European Court and I think, soon at the International Criminal Court. So that's another direction I've taken. I have a top secret security clearance. I'm careful with my country's secrets. Obviously, I mean, I take that seriously. But there are things that I must keep secret that I shouldn't have to keep secret. And every once in a while, I think I should be like Dan Ellsberg and tell the world what it has the right to know. Am I willing to go to jail? Not quite yet. But for example, the black sites where my client was tortured, the world has a right to know what happened, and it shouldn't be classified. But it is, so I'm, at the moment, keep it that way. But when I give talks, I say, in Europe, I say I come from the country that imprisons more people than any other country in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and imprison 25%. I come from the country that locks people up without trial and has what it calls forever prisoners who've never been tried for anything. There's still 40 of them in Guantanamo. And the country that has troops in 150 countries in the world, but I come in peace. And it always makes people laugh.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a good way to start, but it's how I feel.
Yeah, yeah. How did you come to be involved in representing somebody in Guantanamo?
The first Guantanamo case came to me from a lawyer in France who I had taught with, who wrote an email saying the family's looking for this guy. And I had already decided, we'd had a lot of discussions at NACDL about whether we should represent people in Guantanamo, and I was on the side initially that said no, because it's unethical. We can't be, we can't assure our clients that our conversations will be confidential. The military has told us that they're going to listen in. We shouldn't be putting a stamp of approval on this. And it took me about 10 minutes to switch sides on that debate when somebody said, if we don't do it, they're going to get lawyers. They're going to be bad lawyers. It's going to be a disaster. We just have to do it. And I switched pretty quickly. But I was looking for a case. This case came along. I didn't know anything about it. And I said to my partners, I want to do this. I don't know what it will cost us. There's no money for it. We might have to even hire an interpreter. And the response from the lawyers here was, that's why we became lawyers. Go and do it.
How large is this firm? I never have really.
Well, at this time, it's about 10 people. That time it was about 4 or 5.
Okay.
I mean, it was Friedman, Boyd, Daniels, Hollander, Goldberg, and then Terry Duncan was here for a while. Lee Pfeiffer was here. Zach Ives was here. Various people have come and gone. Now there are, I think, 6 partners and 4 associates, 4 non-partners.
And then staff also.
And staff,
presumably,
yes. Yeah, we have. So there's a lot of us now.
And now, just if you can give me kind of just a summary, what kind of cases do you handle now?
I don't handle that many at this moment, but what I've handled over the past years has been, in addition to the Guantanamo cases that I've had 2, and 1 is thankfully out. Mohamedou al-Salahi is out and wrote a book called Guantanamo Diary, which was a bestseller. It took me 7 years to get it out, and he's out. Ibrahim al-Nasri is facing the death penalty, was tortured very badly. Both were tortured, but he was tortured probably the worst. And we've just won 2 cases in the European Court of Human Rights for him. I've handled lots of child abuse cases, child pornography cases there seem to be a lot of now. I also have represented and currently represent doctors in cases involving the medical board and the DEA. Both of those end up, I've done quite a bit of that. And murder cases, fraud cases, and I'm now associated with chambers in London called Doughty Street Chambers. I'm an associate tenant. So I also do work with them. I don't practice in London, but we have cases together. We had an international parental kidnapping case that started out as a Doughty Street case. So I've done a couple of those, a lot of federal work. And of course, I also did, and it took years, a civil rights case involving a religion that I ended up arguing in the district court in front of Judge Parker in the 10th Circuit. We then had the government kept losing. The government lost in the district court, the government lost in the 10th Circuit. The government lost en banc in the 10th Circuit, and the government lost in the Supreme Court, and I argued all of those except one en banc, but I argued in the Supreme Court. We won a unanimous decision, and ultimately they were able to build their church and drink their sacrament, which is a Schedule I substance. So that was a huge civil rights case that I did with John Boyd in this office. And we did some other civil rights cases along the way involving head shops. But when I've done the civil rights cases, I've always done them with John because they're civil cases.
Yeah.
And I have a habeas case now in North Dakota. I represent, I represented lots of different people. We had a big case in Texas. The Holy Land Foundation is the largest Muslim charity in America. We represented them, had 2 trials, unfortunately lost the second trial, and I have a client doing 65 years for providing charity. Very sad case, but.
And it sounds like these are all basically private pay kind of cases, not appointed cases.
No, Holy Land was appointed. They were indigent. That was a federal case under CJA, the Criminal Justice Act, which is how lawyers get paid in the federal court. I don't think I've done any state cases that were non-paying. I've done some for free, but I haven't done any where the state has paid. I have done federal cases where I've been appointed.
What would incline you to take a case for free?
If I feel like it's an important case for that person. The Guantanamo case took for free, of course. The second one, the ACLU pays, because it was part of this John Adams project that was developed to represent people in Guantanamo. And so the ACLU pays at CJA rates for that one. But I've taken cases for free. I've taken cases. I had a case that I did not try, but I did the appeal, and I was doing the appeal, and I was in Santa Fe when my client's father, I found out, was working 3 jobs to pay me, and I said, that's it, I'll keep going until we're out of courts, which I did, and we could never win that case. It was tried badly, and I didn't try it, but I stopped.
Yeah.
I mean, that was more than I could take. He didn't need to work 3 jobs just to pay me.
Yeah. All right, well, let me switch gears a little bit. You mentioned a son and a husband who I'm sort of assuming is now an ex-husband. So what would you like to tell us about your family?
Yes, that husband became an ex-husband and died a few years ago. I was married again and have another ex-husband. I have a son in Jacksonville, Florida. He is married and has 2 daughters. When he was little, somebody asked him, he must have been 7 or 8, I was in law school, and someone said, "Oh, Jesse, are you going to be a lawyer like your mother?" And my study group was all women. So he said, "Oh no, it's too hard, only women do it."
I love it.
And that's always been his position. He's the director of poker operations at a very big casino in Jacksonville, Florida. He's been in the poker business. He went to art school. In high school, he was looking for an elective to take. He was at Highland High School. And I said, you know, there's a photography course, and I have all these cameras. And I had sold all my darkroom stuff. I had actually sold it to buy him a drum set when he was about 13, so I didn't have any darkroom stuff anymore, which was mostly out of date anyway. But I gave him, I said, look, these are perfectly good cameras. And he took that course and became a photographer, went to the Colorado Institute of Art. But then he got a job dealing poker, and then his career just became in the poker business. His wife is also in the business. She has a radio show that she's the host of, and he's on. It's Ally McDeal and Jesse the Boss, and it's on television, and they've become a big deal in that world. And they also have 2 daughters that I'm very close to. We're all going to Antarctica at Christmas, see penguins. I have a brother who's also going to Antarctica with us, and sister-in-law, and they're in France. She's French, and so I see them as often as I can, and that's pretty much my whole family. I have some cousins.
And then what's your primary interests or involvements outside of the law?
Travel. I travel. I have friends all over the world now because of the work I've done. And I travel, and I have a wonderful poodle who lives here. I have actually moved to New York. So I live in New York part of the time and here part of the time. But my poodle, my wonderful standard poodle, who I almost brought today, but I thought she'd be bored or cause us trouble while she was walking around. She lives in Albuquerque. I share her with someone, and she lives primarily with him. But I travel and see my friends. And
All right, so let's get to the final part of what I want to ask about is what do you consider your most significant contribution to the law?
you know, there are 2 people who are bookends in my legal career. One is Precious Bedell. It took me 15 years to get her out of prison, and she is out now. She just stayed with me recently, and she's now getting a PhD. She went to prison for killing a child, and at that time was addicted, and now has made incredible strides. And through the assistance of a prosecutor in Syracuse, New York, we managed to get her out. I couldn't have done it without his help. And she was teaching a course recently called The Incarceration Nation. She works with incarcerated women and helping them get out. And but they were teaching this course, and the professor came to her and said, "Oh, Precious, I found the perfect book for our course. It's called Guantanamo Diary." And she said, "That's my lawyer it's dedicated to." So Mohamedou Skyped in from Mauritania and was in her class. And for me, it's like, that's really all I need now. Mm-hmm. That's all I need, the 2 of them together. And those 2 and the UDV case, the church case, those were my most significant successes in the law, but that are visible. I think that most of the work I've done as a lawyer, nobody will ever know about, and that's good, because it means that the client did not become a defendant, or the case just went away and nobody ever heard about it. And that work at the very beginning of a case, where you've got someone who's been charged with a crime and you can manage to get through it, make it go away before anyone ever knows, and that person goes on with their life, because anytime there's a trial, it's not good. It's even when you win, it's not good. On that side. The other side, I've done a lot of teaching and mentoring, and I hope that there are lawyers who've benefited from that, and I do now, I do less courtroom stuff and much more teaching, primarily now teaching cross-examination, which lawyers in other parts of the world are interested in. I'm also now on the advisory board for Fair Trials International, which is an international organization that's just come to the U.S. and hasn't even announced our advisory board yet, but will, working on issues involving plea bargains and trial waivers around the world, and the Interpol issues. And so I want to keep doing that. I'd like to figure out a way to help in the immigration crisis, if I can, when people reach the border. If I'm not somewhere that I can't get to the border, I will go and see if I can help, and you know, just try to be of service. Martin Luther King said that the rent you pay for your room here on earth is service to others, and I believe that. I was there in 1963 when 64 or whenever it was, when Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream." I was standing right there underneath where he was. So he too has been a big influence on my life.
And how's the practice of the legal community changed over the course of your career?
You know, the practice has changed. This is still, I think, Albuquerque has a high level of practice, and by that because I've been in other places where I felt like the lawyers weren't as good as the lawyers are here. I also think that we get along better than lawyers do in other places. I mentioned to some lawyer in New York something about a policeman. I said, well, you know, we put out on our listserv, do you have anything about this particular DEA agent or cop? And he said, oh, we would never do that because someone would steal your case. And I said, really?
Yeah.
You know, that would never happen here. We have a relationship with judges here that I think it's not as close as it used to be, or quite as friendly, but when, let me just give you one example. The UDV case, it was in front of Judge Parker. That was the religion case. In front of Judge Parker, we had a 2-week-long preliminary hearing, and we were waiting for the opinion. And this was when PACER was not as sophisticated as it is now. But my client, Jeffrey Bronfman, called me about 6 o'clock at night and said, I think Judge Parker's issued an opinion. I can't quite see it. And so he said, call. And I said, well, I doubt that anyone will be there, but I'll call. And maybe there's a law clerk. And I called, and Judge Parker answered the phone. And I said, oh, Judge Parker, I didn't really expect to hear from you, but Jeffrey says he thinks you ruled. He said, yes, I did. And you need to see it. I said, oh, well, that's a good sign. He said, yes, it is a good sign. And I have a copy here. And I said, I can't come in at 6 o'clock. Now, I used to, when I represented Wenho Lee, I had a key to that courthouse, and because that's where our secure room was, and I could get in there day and night. And I said, I don't still have my ability to get in, Judge. And he said, well, I'm leaving in a few minutes. I'll bring it to you. And I'll drive up. Can you come out? And I said, yes. And so David was here, and I said, where's John? He said, he's downstairs in the gym. I said, you go get him and tell him to be outside in 5 minutes. Tell him he has to do it. So John comes running out. So I'm standing, John Boyd. I'm standing out here, and John Boyd comes out sweating. He says, is Judge Parker really coming here? And I said, yes. And this big white Suburban drives up, and Judge Parker hands us a 60-page opinion. He looks around. He says, do you think someone will think we're doing a drug deal? I said, Judge, they might think I am, but not you. And, you know, and there it was. And I thought afterwards, I said, we shouldn't tell anybody this. because, you know, we shouldn't. But the next day, or a couple days later, I went to a party at Paul Baca's house, and Paul was his court reporter, and everyone there knew. So it wasn't a secret. And I've told this story to people, and they said, a federal judge? And I said, yes. I mean, that's just how New Mexico was. Now, this was in, you know, the early 2000s, but I think there's still some of that here, that, you know, that feeling, that, and I've had it in some other places. In North Dakota, the prosecutor was like that, the federal prosecutor. We worked out a plea deal, and after we worked it out, we all went to lunch together. I think we should be collegial, and, you know, without giving up anything for our clients. And I think here we are. I think we still are, more than in other places.
All right, and let me just ask you if you have any final words of wisdom or anything like that you'd like to leave us with.
You know, I tell law students this. The license to practice law is a license that gives you great power. We have power that other professions don't have. Other professions see a little bit of a person. A plumber comes in and sees the bad sink. An electrician sees the bad wiring. A doctor sees the problem. We see the person. We see the community. We see the system, and we have the ability to change it. And we have to use that ability. And it's lawyers who, you know, when segregation was legal in this country until Brown versus Board of Education, but they were lawyers who understood they had the power to make change. Until Gideon, people didn't have lawyers. And Gideon said, you get to have a lawyer. So we have this tremendous power, and in a criminal case, a lawyer is sometimes the only person standing between a person and the power of his own government. And it's the only time that the government is against its own citizens, is in a legal case. That may not be so true now, but basically, in a legal case, you've got the power, the whole power of the government. And at least it can be said in this country still that you get one person to stand by your side. And being that person as a lawyer is really important. And we have to cherish that and make sure we never lose it.